little bit about where we're going in a moment. But how many of you would recognize the name Justine Sacco? Does that ring a bell for anybody? It may not. Wouldn't surprise me if it didn't. So Justine Sacco was a fairly nondescript communications rep for a media company. And she had 170 followers on Twitter and was flying from New York to South Africa, and en route was sort of tweeting about her experiences as a traveler. And so she was making a bunch of offhand jokes, and right before she took off at Heathrow Airport in London, she tweeted by really any respects of evaluating a racist joke about traveling to Africa. The tweet was something like, heading to Africa, hope I don't get AIDS, just kidding, I'm white. And didn't have anybody respond to it. And in the first half hour or so, then she took off. And what happened while she was in the air, this was 4 or 5 years ago, in the days before Wi-Fi on flights. What happened while she was in the air was that her tweet went viral. And she was the #1 trend on Twitter, her name was. This was all while she was in the air and she wasn't aware of it. And so when she landed and she got cell phone signal back, she realized that this obviously problematic and idiotic post of hers had become worldwide famous, and that really, while she was in the air, before she knew it, she had lost her job. And so I share that story mostly to give you a sense of the kind of world we live in, and the way that social media has changed the world. Information transfer happens instantly. The things we post can go from being shared with 100 of the people that follow us to the millions of people on a social media platform like that. And these are all the kind of things that we'll need to consider when we think about what is the place of social media in our lives. So where are we going? I want to talk about the impulse to be social and why I think that that's actually a good thing to start. And then we're going to talk about potentially some limitations of social media, as well as what community is actually supposed to be. And I'm going to argue that it's something like being known and loved in the flesh. And then finally, we'll talk about some practical takeaways for what this means for how we use social media. There are a lot of slides and probably too much content for you to write down. If you want to take notes, feel free. I'm not going to stop you. Just be aware that I will probably go too fast for you to copy all of the things down. And I can make sure that this is available to you all online. I'll talk to Jeremy and make sure that you can get access to a copy of the PowerPoint. All right, so the impulse to be social. When we think about why social media is so attractive, it's easy to think about all the bad reasons that people are attracted to social media, but there are actually some really good reasons that one might be attracted to social media. And if we were to think about it from a biblical perspective, we could go straight away to the very beginning of the biblical story, right, to the creation account. And the creation account is going to provide for us a couple different indications that show us that we were really meant to be social creatures, that we are social creatures. We're designed by God for community. Think about this. What is the first thing that is not good in the Bible? Right? What's the first thing that's not good? Yeah, it is not good for man to be alone. Note that comes before Genesis 3. That actually comes before the fall, before the entrance of sin into the world. The very first thing that's described as not good in the Bible is that man would be alone. So there's something intrinsic to what it means to be made in the image of God that indicates that we're not supposed to be alone, that we're actually made for community. And the language that Genesis 1 and 2 uses to describe us is that we are made in the image of God. Now there's a number of different things that theologians have argued that phrase, image of God, or imago Dei in the Latin, that what does it mean to be made in the image of God? And there's probably a number of things that could be folded into that. But at least one thing that ought to be is that we're created to be in relationship. Why does the image of God tell us that we were created to be in relationship? Well, think about God himself, right? God exists in a Trinity. He's always existed in a Trinity. There has never been a moment where God didn't exist as Father, Son, and Spirit. So therefore, God in his person has always existed in relationship with himself in this mysterious Trinitarian three-in-oneness. And so when we think about what are some of the ways that human beings image God, we too are beings created to be in relationship. First and foremost, to be in relationship with God, but also to be in relationship with one another. And so that's also part of our social impulse, is that we actually image God by our desire to know other people and be known by other people. And you get this picture of connection throughout Scripture, and especially in the creation narrative, of this longing to be both known and loved. And that's often sort of my working definition for intimacy or for community, is this idea that people both know you and love you at the same time. We'll talk a bit more about that challenge of being known and loved at the same time as we go forward. Social media phenomena. So here's a question. What makes social media different from other forms of communication that have come before? This is open to y'all, yeah. It's not verbal. Good. Mm-hmm. Okay, so there's the digital medium, and yeah, I suppose it depends on the social media medium in terms of the degree to which it's words, images, video, Other things that make social media unique or different from other previous forms of media. Mm-hmm. That's right. So there's the public nature of it, right? That you can post something. We could use the Justine Sacco example where she really intended it to be sort of a stupid and obviously in poor taste joke to the 100 or so people that followed her Twitter feed, and instead she found out that she was sending it to however many billion Twitter users there are. And it's probably still in the hundreds of millions, but anyway. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep, and we'll talk a bit more as we go on about the sort of potential ways it can be addictive. Now, that's an interesting question, whether or not there were previous forms of media or communication that were addictive, or So I suppose an interesting question would be to see if the 1980s teenager was addicted to hanging out on the landline and talking to their friends, and maybe they were, but it was probably different in certain ways than social media today. Any others? Mm-hmm.
I guess the desire to be well received by others instead of just regular communication.
Sure. So there's that reciprocating sort of responsiveness to social media that really shapes what we choose to post and how we post. Uh-huh. Yeah, absolutely, right? Think about, I remember when I was in 4th grade, I went to space camp, and as a 4th grader, it was my first time away from home at length. And if I wanted to talk to my parents, I had to call collect on the payphone. And most of you are like, have never done that in your life. But it was this, it was this really arduous process, and you had to, you hoped that they were home when you called, because if they weren't, you were out of luck. Those kind of things. And so, whereas our social media communication, it has this immediacy, right? It comes right to you. It's actually harder to miss it than to get it a lot of the time. You actually have to work harder to avoid social media than you have to actually receive it. So that was one of mine. Immediate. There's little time or filter between thinking something and posting it. So there's no editorial board that's reviewing your tweets or Snapchats before you send them. The editorial board is here. Hopefully it's got a decent filter, and you say good, smart things. And if you don't hopefully it doesn't go viral, I suppose. It's public, so what you post on the internet has the potential to be public. We'll note that this is true regardless of whatever your privacy settings are. There's good reasons to be really responsible with your use of privacy settings on social media, but one of the things that we should know about the internet is that the internet has what we call the myth of anonymity. It gives you the feeling that all the things you're doing on the internet are anonymous, but none of them are actually anonymous. Or to put it another way, all of them have the potential to be not anonymous. With social media, it's as simple as somebody taking a screenshot and sending it. Okay, so that's worth noting, that things that you do on social media are always to some degree public communications. And in this way are somewhat different than like, conversations that you have in person with someone, or something you're sort of banding about in the living room as you're discussing an idea or something. If you do that exact same thing on the internet, there's actually this log and record of all your thoughts, even if they're incomplete or not fully developed. And then scope can reach more people than ever before on social media. So you can communicate to large numbers of people in ways that you can never have done with the old telephone of the previous generation. Some real quick stats you can see. So Facebook, these are February 2017, so they're a little outdated, but Facebook has 1.86 billion users. That's, and there's 7.5 billion people in the world, so it has a pretty good saturation. Twitter, Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram are all up there as well. So social media phenomena, what is the promise that social media offers us that we often find so attractive? We've kind of talked about some of the things, but let's think about not just what makes it different, but what draws us in about social media. What are some of the things that you love about social media? What do you think? What are some of the things that draw you in and sort of reasons that you enjoy using it? Yeah. So when we post something on social media and it gets views, likes, responses, that actually communicates something to us, right? Communicates some sense of worth, value, of being seen, right? Yeah, absolutely. We'll talk more about that. Good. So you guys have mentioned a number of these things. Connection. So here's one that it actually enables us to take more risks with respect to being known by other people, because it's mediated, right? There's a little bit of distance. The stakes don't feel as high, right? Sometimes the anonymity even of social media can create opportunities to reach out to other people, or to be vulnerable in ways that maybe you wouldn't be willing to risk in your immediate community. So I'm really struggling with depression, but if I were to say that aloud in my immediate community, I'm not sure how it would be received. But if I go on the Reddit forums and see how other people are processing this or dealing with this, I can do that with a throwaway account and it's less risky. And yet I can get some meaningful community out of that, some meaningful connection. It gives us a sense of belonging. So finding others with similar interests, right? This was your point, right? That we can find people, and oftentimes our interests might be sort of these niche interests where the people immediately around us don't share those same things. And so going on the internet, well, there's, billions of people on the internet, so the chances of you finding somebody that has that shared interest, are a lot higher. I think it was C.S. Lewis who said something like, friendship is born at the moment where one person looks at another person and says, "What, you too? I thought I was the only one." Making the point that there's that shared interest is a lot of the spark behind what can generate meaningful friendship. And recognition, you all mentioned this too. The desire to go viral, or even just the ability to be famous, right? We call this the democratization of fame, right? Before, if you wanted to be famous, you had to be like particularly skilled at something, or physically attractive, or a all-star athlete. And now you can be famous for being a YouTuber, right? For commenting on the pop culture moments of the sort of things of the day. For doing stupid human tricks, you can become famous. So there's the ability to become famous has been democratized in the sense that any of us have access to that. This is the reality for a lot of us is when we think about how do we use social media. I think Andy Dwyer or Chris Pratt, who plays Andy Dwyer on Parks and Rec, describes a lot of our experience on social media really well. I have no idea what I'm doing, but I know that I'm doing it really, really well. In other words, like I'm not exactly sure why, or like I don't have a philosophy of social media and how I do it, but I'm sure that I'm doing it well. I'm really sure. And that level of self-confidence that we have is probably something that we should be willing to question. Our level of self-confidence about how we use social media. Because if we were to take a poll around the room, I think most of us would probably want to say, well, yeah, I use social media, but I'm one of the responsible people. And so one of the things we're going to talk about today is this willingness to actually sort of interrogate ourselves with respect to our social media use. So what are some of the benefits of social media? You guys have already mentioned a number of sort of why we use them, what the desires are. Obviously, connecting with distant family and friends, making new connections based on interests are just a couple. We could name a number of other ones, and you all have already mentioned a few. So I want to start there, because if you think about the biblical story doesn't start with sin and the fall or the problems with a particular thing. It actually starts with creation and the inherent goodness of creation. And so when we think about social media and the impulse to be social, we should start with that first statement, that it's actually the thing that draws us towards social media isn't just sin, whatever the potential problems may be with social media, but the thing that draws us towards social media is actually this really good desire, this God-given desire to connect to and relate with other people. So I say that because we're going to spend a lot of time talking about its limitations, because I don't think that you need me to convince you that it's good, but I want to make sure that I say that so that you don't walk out of here thinking, oh, he's just, he just hates on social media. So limitations of social media. What do you all think? Let's open it up to you first, and then I'll give you a few of my ideas of what some limitations of social media might be. What do you think? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it could replace other types of community, other types of social interaction, and we might lose something. We might lose something important in terms of, the people that are right in front of us. Yeah, good. Yeah, we'll definitely talk about that, right? That what we see when we see a person on social media is never the whole picture. Even if they want it to be the whole picture, it's just impossible, right? Like what you post on the internet will always be edited. It will always go through a filter of, I decided to post this and not this, and here's my reason why. Whether that reason's conscious or subconscious, there's always that going on in the background. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and someone else mentioned this, the sort of addictive nature to it. You start just scrolling through your timeline or your stories or whatever, and you look up at the clock and suddenly you've spent 45 minutes on Instagram for no particular reason, and none of you have ever done that, so we don't even need to address that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so especially, so that sense of let's say I go to the internet or to an online community as a way of getting the support that I need, that sense of if that's all I have, when that computer turns off or when those people are unavailable, there's still this vacuum of the loneliness or the lack of immediate relationship that no amount of sort of online connection can bridge. We'll go back there. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Right, this is the reason, so in a sense, this is the analogous thing here is road rage, right? Why does road rage happen? The things that you think, say, or do towards other drivers, those of you that are driving, your filter for what you're willing to think, say, or do to them is so low compared to if you were sitting across the table from them, because they're not a person, they're just this autonomous vehicle moving about, cutting you off, right? So if they're just an autonomous vehicle, I can say whatever I want because they're not, a person with feelings. And the reason we think that is because all we see is the vehicle, right? Well, social media and the internet do the same sort of thing. All we see is an avatar or a screen name or whatever, and it actually creates a distance from that person that allows us to treat them as less of a human being. And it, in that way, makes it harder to have meaningful communication and conversation or debate or dialogue, even when you want to, even when you walk into it with the best of intentions. That's a great point. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sure. Yeah, well, and even the way that social media sort of subtly demands or suggests that you need to say something about everything. And if you're not saying something about everything, you're doing something wrong, right? And that creates this sort of implicit pressure of, what's the thing that's trending now? Have I commented on it? Do I even know what the thing is? I better go find out what the thing is so I can know what the right opinion is, that sort of thing. And it creates this demand for you to be an expert in everything. And so everybody shares their opinion, and this happens all the time with politics, right? Politics is an easy example. This is why many of you are probably like, I avoid politics at all costs on social media because this is all the time. And this is especially true on Twitter, which again is like my primary platform. So most of my sort of illustrations are coming through that avenue. But when we think about, so you guys have said a lot of good things. The three categories that I want to consider as sort of broad limitations of social media, and you'll think of all, we've already mentioned a lot of specific examples that fall into these, are the totalizing power of social media, the nature of social media as a performative art, and thirdly, social media as an echo chamber. So social media as a totalizing power. It's a fun phrase. What does it mean? It means that. It means you're sitting at the table with a bunch of other people that you've gotten together to hang out with, and you all have your phones out at the same time, right? None of you have had this experience before. Like family holidays are another really good example. You're all together with extended family, so like you only get together 2 times a year, and yet to pause for a moment and see, is there ever a time where everybody's actually on their own screen? And if your family's anything like my family, that certainly has been the case. And so when we talk about social media as a totalizing power, that's what we mean, is that even though it says, hey, I just want to be a segment of your social life, it has this tendency to shove its way into all the other aspects of your life. And in shoving its way into all the other aspects of your life, it actually pushes other things out. So in the case of the image, it's pushing out the immediate relationships of the people that they're sitting across the table from. Well, another way we can think about the totalizing power of social media is to think about it as an addiction, and this has been mentioned, by several of you, that this is sort of based on APA's definition of addiction a bit. That addiction is a compulsive behavior that leads to it taking over one's life, such that you continue to do it even when you know that it's going to cause you problems, right? So that's the sort of nature of addiction, is that it's compulsive. It demands that you do it. Even when you know it's bad, it doesn't matter. You're still going to do it because you're sort of all in addicted to it. And social media can be this. We often say, like, one of the ways that you know if you have an addiction is if you make all sorts of promises about how you're going to reduce your social media usage or take a fast from it or kick it for Lent or something. And you say, oh, I could totally do that, but I don't need to yet. That sort of thing. So it pushes out other forms of relationship and communication. The image is a good example of that. This is a point that none of us have actually mentioned yet, but is actually really important too, that it can, when we think about it being a time suck, why do we do that to ourselves? Is it that social media is actually that interesting? Sometimes it is. A lot of times we spend an hour scrolling through a feed and at the end of it are like, what did I just do? Like there was nothing there that was even remotely interesting. And so that makes you think, like, if this was anything else, I would not do that, right? If this was a really dumb TV show, I'd turn it off, or if it was, a lecture in college, I would decide that I was dropping the class or something like that. And yet with respect to social media, we actually are okay with it being that way, and that question of why is important. I think the answer to it, at least partially, is because one of the things that it does is it takes us out of our immediacy, out of our immediate lives, and sometimes that's a relief, right? Sometimes the immediacy of our lives are fraught with all sorts of difficulties or trials, and so being distracted by other people's lives can actually be a way of, getting out of ourselves and essentially numbing some of our pain. Yeah. Sure. Yeah, I think the phenomena is the exact same. I think the difference is that social media is designed to make it harder for you to stop. That the way feeds are designed, the fact that they don't have an end, right? That you could literally just do it forever. That's intentional programming by software designers. They're sitting down thinking, okay, what are the ways I can maximize the amount of time you spend on our platform? And so that's why it's designed that way. And the other thing that's a little bit different about social media is it's far more aggressive at going after you. Right? So you have to make a decision to sit down and open up the newspaper. But social media actually comes for you, and it notifies you with dings and says, hey, come look at me, come look at me. Why aren't you looking at me? Look at how this little red number, it keeps going up, those are sort of ways that like are actually, when we think about the software designers that are behind a lot of the programming, some of the addictive elements are very much intentional design elements. And there's been a number of folks that have really pushed on Silicon Valley and said, hey, one of the things that you all need on your teams are actually ethicists that like can sit down and say, is this a good idea? Or is this morally right to do this kind of thing? But what's amazing about it is all that's subtle enough that we don't quite. It's not easy for us to be sort of consciously aware that that's what's going on. But trust me, the software designers are. So Adam Alter actually wrote a book exactly about this called Irresistible: The Rise of Addictive Technology and the Business of Keeping Us Hooked. One of his observations is that in 2008, adults spent an average of 18 minutes on their phones per day. In 2015, they were spending 2 hours and 48 minutes on their phone. That was 2015, so it's probably higher now. So that probably doesn't surprise us. And why is 2008 a meaningful date? You don't know? Yeah, it's the first iPhone, if my memory's serving me right, was 2008. So the arrival of the iPhone and the smartphone and the internet and social media at your fingertips is obviously the big change there. So Alter also says this. Walter Isaacson, he was a biographer for the late Steve Jobs, who ate dinner with the Jobs family while researching his biography of Steve Jobs, told Bilton that no one ever pulled out an iPad or computer. The kids did not seem addicted at all to the devices. It seemed as if the people producing tech products were following the cardinal rule of drug dealing: never get high on your own supply. You can actually Google this and see that there are a number of major leaders at various social media companies that themselves don't participate in the social media that they help design because they know how it's made, because they know of its addictive impulses, or at the very least, if they do it, they don't let their kids do it, right? And that's the point here is like Steve Jobs knows, what an iPad does in front of a kid. My daughter is 17 months, and she already knows how to swipe just because when the phone's been out, she's figured it out intuitively. And if the phone's around, she will demand it. And she'll often, and there are some good things about it, right? It lets her FaceTime with her grandparents and extended family that she wouldn't see very often. And so sometimes she reaches for the phone and says, Nana, Papa, because she thinks they live in the phone or something. But there are also all the ways in which, even at that age, she's already being sort of intuitively trained to need it. And obviously, I've never been a drug dealer, but I imagine that this is good advice to not get high on your own supply. So that's the first limitation. The second limitation is social media as performative art. And again, we've talked about some of the specifics. You mentioned some of the specifics. But social media can actually become a way of advertising our best selves, right? So we've talked about the fact that what we post is always curated, and oftentimes what that means is that we're picking what to post, and we're picking the best moments of our lives. What it also means is that when we go look at other people's social media, we're often comparing our reality to other people's sort of manicured fantasy. So when we go and compare ourselves to other people that we find on social media, we'll often find our own life experience lacking or inferior, not because it actually is, but because we're comparing our reality with all its messiness and difficulty with something that's absolutely not reality, or is such a small snapshot of reality that it actually is incomplete information. So it can be a way of advertising our best selves. And in this way, it's actually often inauthentic or carefully manicured. And this is a really interesting phenomenon given the fact that if you look at the sort of millennial and then your generation, one of the highest values that your generation tends to have is authenticity. And yet your generation is also the one that is most likely to be on social media and fluent with social media. And so there's this sort of paradox between I deeply desire authenticity and vulnerability, but also this platform that lets me mediate and manicure my image is also highly attractive. There's a marketing element to social media. whether you're aware of it or not, if you Google social media marketing, you realize like this is a billion-dollar business, is social media marketing. And you're thinking, oh, companies, but there are, even as individuals, there's social media marketing agencies that if you were to shoot them an email and pay them a few $1,000s, they would explain exactly how you can get more follows, likes, whatever. And so social media ends up often being a walking advertisement of yourself, a sort of public resume, a personal resume. And this has implications in a lot of different directions. One of the biggest is the things that you post today, are things that you could be held accountable for when you're applying for your first job after college. And you're sitting there thinking, I don't know if I want my employer to know what my 14-year-old self was thinking. And all of us are probably have thought or said things as a teenager where we're like, yeah, that's probably not the thing I would put on the front and center of my resume. And yet social media is actually a really long resume. And again, yeah, you have your privacy settings and this, that, and the other. But, God forbid you become famous or something and someone takes a screenshot before you can go back and delete and edit all your old posts. So you see this all the time with professional athletes, right? Prospective NBA player about to get drafted, and it turns out that when he was 13, he tweeted something really dumb. And before he hired his PR agency, when he realized he was going to get drafted in the NBA draft or whatever, someone had already gone back and looked at all his old stuff and screenshotted it, and now he's got to deal with that as a prospective prospect. So that sort of thing is worth noting. That everything you do on social media, especially in terms of profiles and stuff like that, there's a public aspect of it. There's a resume sort of building aspect of it. It's consumeristic. I put mine on Do Not Disturb just to avoid the irony of being notified by social media while giving a talk about it. So it's consumeristic in the sense that it appeals to all our desire to monetize everything, right? So much of the desire for clicks going viral is just to get money, right? You want to have enough subscribers on YouTube that you can start to monetize your profile and make decent advertising money. And if you're really good at it, you can actually skip college and not get a job. It can be your job. Like being a professional YouTuber is a thing in 2018, which one would have never thought 10 years ago, but. The last element of it as performative art is that it can sometimes have a narcissistic element to it. So there's a sense in which you could get distracted, lost in other people, but you might also be so consumed with how you present yourself that you end up in this sort of narcissistic world where you're actually unable to look beyond yourself, that everything is only a reflection of yourself. And so this is a nice, funny Venn diagram. Those of you who have had me in class know I love Venn diagrams. This is a good one. Narcissism, ADHD, and stalking. You can see which of the social media platforms is, lines up with your particular penchants. The last of the limitations, the social media echo chamber. So social media can be a source of cheap affirmation. What do we mean by that? Any ideas? What would it mean that social media could be a source of cheap affirmation, or it can be an echo chamber? What does that mean? And so then when you post something, what's going to happen? Yeah, you're going to get a lot of likes, right? Because you've decided to friend the type of people that would like the kind of things that you post. Yeah, what are you going to say? Yeah, absolutely. So there's a sort of chasing of after affirmation of approval that can come from it. Yeah, in the same way that there's a sort of superficiality about the communication medium, and so the value of the affirmation is going to be directly related to the medium itself. Good. So there's another way that the echo chamber can work, which is it can create a sort of tribalism. So you follow people on Twitter that all share the same political view as you. And so all the views you ever get, all the perspectives you get on controversy X are from the same angle. And so what that does is actually prevents you from considering alternate viewpoints, critically assessing, is the view that I have actually right? Well, the best way to find out if the view that you have is actually right is to listen to the best argument of the opposing view. And if all you follow on social media is people who share the exact same view as you, you're really unlikely to get the best form of the opposing argument. So I make a practice of this with respect to politics. I make sure that on Twitter I follow some people that I radically disagree with, but who are the most competent thinkers I can find of the positions that I disagree with, so that I'm at least exposing myself to how are these people thinking about these challenging issues. And then the issues that you guys are hearing about this week have some of those kind of things that you're hearing discussions about creation, you're hearing discussions about politics and race and all these different things that have various viewpoints. And so exposing yourself to the multiplicity of those viewpoints is one of the ways that you can actually use social media to enrich your understanding. And yet, most of us have a penchant to do this because it's a lot easier. It feels a lot better to know that you're on the winning team. And much better than to have the sort of unsettling feeling of knowing that there are smart people who might disagree with you. So I know Twitter wars because that's my experience of seeing it. There's this phrase called virtue signaling. And the idea of virtue signaling is essentially that you post something solely because you know that in your community it will appear virtuous. Other people will think, yeah, that's right, and they will respond by saying, you are so virtuous, and don't we all like that feeling? So with respect to tribalism, are you coming to bed? I can't, this is important. What? Someone is wrong on the internet. If you've never, this is from the comic strip XKCD. If you've never used the internet to view XKCD, it's definitely worth your time. This is a quote from Marilyn Robinson talking about the notion of virtue signaling. She's not talking about it in the context of social media. This was written before then. But she says this, very simply, it's a great example of our collective eagerness to disparage without knowledge or information about the thing disparaged, when the reward is the pleasure of sharing an attitude one knows is socially approved. She's actually talking about why people hate the Puritans and talk bad about the Puritans. And her whole point is people talk bad about the Puritans because it looks good. People like when you talk bad about the Puritans. And so it, makes you, especially in academic circles, makes you really, seem like you know what you're about. But the whole point is that without knowledge or information about the thing disparaged, you share your perspective, right? You don't have expertise on it, but you know if I share the right view according to my sub-community, according to my echo chamber, I will get approval, right? And I do it solely for the pleasure that comes from knowing that the view that I espouse will be approved, regardless of whether it's the right view or not. So it actually becomes a short circuit to critical thinking. It short circuits the question, what is the truth, for what will make me feel good? Which, if there wasn't that's like the perfect description of our cultural moment. So when we think about all the limitations of social media, there's this quote by Wendell Berry, who's a writer, he's an older writer that has some critical things to say about technology in general, but this is not about technology, it's about drugs. I keep using drugs as a metaphor. People use drugs, legal and illegal, because their lives are intolerably painful or dull. They hate their work and find no rest in their leisure. They're estranged from their families and their neighbors. It should tell us something that in healthy societies, drug use is celebrative, convivial, and occasional, whereas among us it is lonely, shameful, and addictive. We need drugs, apparently, because we have lost each other. So I guess one way you could summarize my argument is if you replaced drugs with social media, this quote would still ring true in a lot of respects for how our culture broadly uses social media. Now, not everyone all the time, but generally speaking. So this is the point is this is how we think we use social media really smart, but really we think we're April in the foreground, but really we're Andy in the background. Apologies to those of you that don't watch Parks and Rec. That's what Christy and I are actually addicted to, is Parks and Rec. All right, so community, which I essentially want to say is, it's not the antidote to social media, because social media isn't in itself an intrinsic evil, but it is something that social media is chasing after that we can find in its truest form in other places. So when we think about, my definition of community is essentially being known and loved in the flesh. Now, obviously, it can include being known and loved in other contexts, but it finds its epitome, its core essence, in being known and loved in the flesh. And by in the flesh, I just mean like immediately, like with the person in front of you, physically in front of you. And so we get a model of this in Scripture, right? The model of the incarnation, right? Because if God wanted to know you and love you fully, what would God do if he really wanted to express his love for you fully and he wanted to gain a full knowledge of what it is to be one of his created beings made in his image? Well, maybe he would become human, right? So Jesus' incarnation suggests that we need to be known and loved in the flesh. The fact that Jesus became human and that God speaks to us through an incarnate Christ actually is probably the single strongest theological argument against community solely being digital or mediated or on a social platform. The fact that when God wanted to save the world, he entered it himself tells us that there's something good about physical closeness, about being actually in our bodies. There was this movement in the early church, sort of a heretical movement during the time of the early church called Gnosticism. And Gnosticism essentially suggested that you would gain true salvation if you could escape your body. Your body and your material self was actually a prison, and that your real goal should be to escape it, to achieve true transcendence. And in a lot of ways, that's sort of what we can try to do with social media, is try and escape the immediacy of our bodies by sort of transcending outside of our immediate presence and place and interact with people everywhere else. And it gives us the illusion that we can be everywhere to everyone at all times. And it's simply not true. We actually can't. And it wouldn't even be good if we could, because God himself decided it was actually good for him to become present in a particular place at a particular time to a particular people. So then the implication is that the need to be loved in the flesh is not just by God himself, but also by other people. And we think about, where do we see that in the New Testament? Well, we see it predominantly in the context of the community of believers that is the local church. So this is a quote from Tim Keller about this notion of being known and loved. He says this: to be loved but not known is comforting but superficial. And wouldn't that be so true of so much of our social media interactions? Is lots of affirmation without very much knowledge. To be known and not loved is our greatest fear. If you really knew everything about me, if you comprehensively knew me, you'd run the other direction. That's the fear. But to be fully known and truly loved is, well, a lot like being loved by God. It's what we need more than anything. It liberates us from pretense, humbles us out of our self-righteousness, and fortifies us for any difficulty life can throw at us. And he's saying, in the context of his book, he's talking about marriage, but this is really true of any community, because in a way, this is the reflection of how God loves us, right? He knows us completely, even better than we know ourselves, and yet he loves us nonetheless. And that this is the greatest source of security in any relationship. And you can think about the security you have in a relationship based on sort of proportionate level of knowledge. So the more you know about me, the more value your displays of affection or love for me will hold, right? This was the point that was being made earlier, right? That if you don't know me very well, all that affirmation feels kind of cheap, right? But if you've known me for a decade, I think about my friends that I've known for a long time. When I get affirmation from them, or when I'm in a relationship with them, they know lots of things about me. They've seen me in lots of different moments of my life, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And so the fact that they're still there and haven't run out the door means way more to me than, if this post that I put up on Facebook got, enough likes or not. So the community of the church, essentially what I want to say is there are sort of three ministries of the church that address the three limitations of social media. So that first limitation of social media was its tendency to totalize, to take everything out. So the ministry, the community of the church provides a ministry of presence, provides a ministry of grace, and it provides a ministry of discipleship. So the ministry of presence, it's this in-the-flesh presence, this tangible, costly presence. Think about this. If someone just says, hey, do you want to go out to coffee? I just want to catch up, see how you're doing. they're choosing to do that instead of something else. And they're really choosing to do that instead of something else if they keep their phone in their pocket the whole time or put it on Do Not Disturb or something like that. They are giving up something in order to be with you. Or if you're in a relationship with someone else and you choose to spend time with them, you're giving up something in order to be with them. You're saying you are worth my time, right? And what we communicate actually is if when we try to set up time to hang out with people and we end up spending all our time on our phones instead, we're actually saying you are far less interesting than what I can find on the internet. And it's easy to do that because the internet has tons of things, right? It has infinite things. And yet, when we choose to actually be present with people fully, we communicate a sense of worth to them that can't be received really any other way. It's not always efficient, right? So it is easy, in certain ways, it's easier to change the world using social media. It's easier to change the world online than it is to do it in the individual relationships in front of you. And yet, just because it's easier, even if it's more effective, that doesn't actually make it grounds for what Christians should do. That doesn't make it the right thing to do. There are a lot of things that might be more efficient than spending one-on-one time or even time with a community of friends. But there are a few things that are more valuable. The temptation in our age is to imagine that we can all be famous, that we can all change the world if we just have the most insightful blog, if we can just have this social media presence, this viral video, whatever the thing is. And what happens is we tend to start to say that's more valuable than just being faithful where I'm at in this limited place that I'm at. And the reality is that if you chase fame like that, you will always be chasing it more and more. Whereas if you can accept your limited calling, that you are just a creature and you can't be multiple places at once, that actually embracing your locality, your being a particular person in a particular place, will be far more satisfying to you in the long run than any amount of chasing likes or affirmation online. We mentioned it conveys worth and value. This is a quote from Catholic theologian Henry Nouwen, who is I don't know if he coined the term ministry of presence, but he talks a lot about the notion of a ministry of presence. And Nouwen was a really well-known and famous dude. He was actually a well-regarded professor at Ivy League schools, and he gave it up. He quit his job in order to go work with mentally handicapped people in Canada at a home. From the world's perspective, this made no sense. He had this big platform, he was well regarded, and he went and hung out with a bunch of people that couldn't appreciate his intellectual gifts at all. But a lot of his point was that he actually learned far more about what it means to be loved and in community in the context in Canada than he had elsewhere. So he says, it's a privilege to have the time to practice the simple ministry of presence. Still, it's not as simple as it seems. My own desire to be useful, to do something significant, or to be part of some impressive project is so strong that soon my time is taken up by meetings, conferences, study groups, and workshops that prevent me from walking the streets. It's difficult not to have plans, not to organize people around an urgent cause, and not to feel like you're working directly for social progress. But I wonder more and more if the first thing shouldn't be to know people by name, to eat and drink with them, to listen to their stories and tell your own, and to let them know with words, handshakes, and hugs that you do not simply like them, but truly love them. That sense of there are always going to be things knocking on your door saying, hey, give me attention. There are infinite number of causes that you could align yourself to, and many of them are good, and some of them you should do. But if you do all of them, you will miss something. You'll miss what is right in front of you, the community that is immediately in front of you. The ministry of grace speaks to the penchant that we have for social media to be performative art. So if social media is performative art, I want to put on a guise, I put on a mask for everyone, then what the church does is it offers a ministry of grace, meaning you can actually take off that mask. You actually don't have to present your edited self. You can present your unedited self, and that would be okay. The German theologian and pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer described community as meeting one another as bringers of the message of salvation. That what makes the church a unique kind of community is it's the kind of community that you could gather together where you needn't fear judgment because everyone's gathering there for the express purpose of essentially preaching the gospel to one another. That it's okay, that you are indeed, imperfect and a sinner because you need the gospel just as much as the person across the table from you. It frees us from posturing, frees us from marketing ourselves so that we're free to give and receive grace in the midst of our imperfections. So we can receive grace from other people in the midst of our own weakness, and then we can give it back too. And that this is actually a far more rewarding means of satisfaction than the likes or approval we get when we post our manicured selves on the internet. And then the last thing that the church does is the ministry of discipleship. And this speaks to the echo chamber, right? That we use social media to just hear from other people that agree with us. And again, Bonhoeffer says that the church offers a call to discipleship, which is not cheap affirmation. That it actually calls us out of ourselves. It says, yes, you're saved just as you are, but God never leaves you just where you are. He actually always calls you out to something else. Namely, he calls you to come and die, right? That's actually the call of discipleship. Take up your cross and follow me, Jesus says in the Gospels. That there isn't cheap affirmation there. There's actually a strong challenge that comes from being part of this sort of community. It's also a place where we can cultivate character, the wisdom and courage to do what's right in the overwhelming face of cultural pressure, to bend our ethics whenever it's convenient, and then hold us accountable to that standard. Calls us to put our money where our mouth is, namely in ministry to others as well. So we're moving towards sort of practical, and then on the practical side, I'm going to lean heavily on you all to come up with the answers to all these difficult questions. But Alistair Roberts says this. He says, the church is like the boat from which oxygen can be pumped to submerged divers, preventing them from drowning in the abyss and providing them somewhere safe to which they can resurface. We are better social media users when we are rooted in something other than social media. So the point is not you shouldn't use social media. The point is, if social media is your oxygen tank, it's going to run out. That you need to be connected to some sort of community that's going to provide you something more life-giving than the things that social media itself can provide. All right, so practical takeaways. What are some things we can do to be better social media users? So what I want you to do is break up with the person next to you or groups of 2 or 3 with the people around you. And see if between you can come up with one thing that you want to share with us, one way that you can become better social media users. And your job here is to be as practical as possible. So as concrete and practical as possible. You have 2 minutes, go. So we've had a chance to talk about kind of the positive impulse towards being social, some of the limitations of social media. Talked a little bit about the church as a community that actually, if we deeply invest in our relationships with fellow believers, that actually is going to be sort of the source of the kind of community that we need to be good social media users. But the question really is, okay, so what are you going to do when you walk out of the room? That's the real question. What are some things we can do to be better social media users? What do you all think? Let's start here. Sorry, let's start here and then go back. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. So you could turn off notifications as a way to fight back against the programmers that know, those of us who are Myers-Briggs Jays, any of you who know Myers-Briggs know that you need closure, and those red dots, they just scream at you. Why aren't you doing your job? So if you can get rid of them, then maybe that will help. Good. Okay. Other thoughts? We'll go in the back and then up. Yeah, and the silent thing is not unimportant, or I could just say is important, because if you're like me and you have your phone on vibrate all the time, that's what I usually do. That's not the same thing, right? If it buzzes in your pocket, it demands something, right? We are like Pavlov's dog with respect to buzzes in the pocket. It buzzes in the pocket, and you're like, yep. You take it out and look at it without even thinking about it, or I do at least. So that notion of it being silent, so that and we can come up with all sorts of justifications for why we can't have it on silent, right? Like, what if someone needs to reach us in an emergency or something like that? But the reality is, unless you're expecting that kind of call, the chances of you needing to be reached with that level of immediacy are so low. And, I don't know, the universe survived for lots of millennia without that ability, that it's probably not worth it. So how do you think you go about closing the gap between the person that we present ourselves to be and the person that we actually are? Like, we think about this really in any realm, right? Like, that's actually where the word integrity came from. It came from being an integrated person, meaning the person that I am over here is the same as the person I am here. Like, we think about that with different social groups that you walk in. Am I the same person? Well, you're never going to be the identical person, but how big is the gap between the person I am here versus here? And one of the places where there's often a huge gap is the person I am on social media, the person I am here. So maybe I'll broaden that question. You can answer it if you'd like, but anyone who wants to chime in too. How do you close that gap between the person that you present yourself to be and the person that you actually are? So that is a super great piece of advice, namely the part where it's like, if you're going to post something, it's almost always worth pausing, like waiting five seconds, reading it again, and then waiting 5 more minutes and then deciding to post it. Especially if it's informed by a high degree of like heightened emotion, because that sense of immediacy, I can't get it back. Like, so I will give you a personal example. I enjoy watching sports a lot, and anyone who's watched sports with me knows I have a penchant for blaming referees for things. And one of the things that social media does is it creates this awesome platform for you to yell about how bad the refs were and that's why your team lost. And a bunch of people will be like, yeah, you're right, they are terrible people. And so if my wife were here, she would testify to the fact that what I do now is in order to get my need of, like, I need to shout this from the rooftops to the world met, I type my tweet in and then I just don't send it. And if I'm really struggling, I do send it and then delete it. And you can kind of tell, like, how bad is Kyle struggling with this filter based on, did I have to type it at all? Did I send it and delete it? Like, those are that's how you know. And the point is, like, we all could use that gap between highly charged emotion, thing I want to shout from the rooftops, to actually sending it. Because oftentimes that 5 minutes is enough to make you stop letting your heightened emotional state, overrule any sort of rationality, and then you tend to make better choices. There's a bunch of sociological and psychological data that shows too that when you make choices in that sort of heightened emotional state, that if you were to wait 5 minutes, you would make a very different choice. And so there's good reasons to do that too, just on a psychological level. And it also prevents you from, like, the endless Twitter typos, since they don't let you edit on Twitter. Other practical things. What are things we can do to be better social media users? Huh? Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, how many memes are there out there about, like, how many people you've persuaded to change their position because you commented on their Facebook status or whatever, And yet, it's, we so often get drawn into those kind of conflicts. So that would be an interesting thing to consider, like, what are the fights that are worth having online? And the list of fights that are worth having online is probably a really, really short list. So, good. Here? Exactly. That desire to use social media as a platform for affirmation is going to exist to the degree to which our insecurities dominate our motivations for using social media. And all of us use social media out of insecurity at times. So that's not like you insecure people have a real problem. Like, all of us have that impulse to use social media as something that comes out of our insecurity versus out of our security in real relationships. And I think that's the point about community. If you have a rich, meaningful community that knows who you are, that's going to give you a great deal of security so that when you go to use social media, you aren't using it to get needs met by people that live millions of miles away who don't even know you, by the number of likes that you get or something like that. Others? Yeah, that notion that I don't use social media just for myself, but rather, so not just to receive, but actually to give, to minister to others in some sort of concrete, meaningful way. It's good. Yeah. Any others? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it comes back to that notion of insecurity. If I post something out of insecurity, then I need other people to respond to it a certain way, and if they don't, then, I've lost something. So I'll give you some of mine. You all have hit a number of them. One is just invest in meaningful community. Some concrete ways to do it. Hey, be present with people. Turn your phone off or on Do Not Disturb. Silence, not vibrate. Spend more time in face-to-face conversation with people you do know than in digital conversation with people you don't know. Okay? Especially so that using social media to converse with people you have that you don't know very well, you're going to have a diminishing return on investment based on how well you know that person. So if I get into a Twitter fight with a fan of Tottenham who happens to be the rival soccer team to Arsenal, like my likelihood of that being a profitable engagement is really low because I don't know that person at all, they don't know me, and we are on opposite ends of the spectrum. So basically, the less you know a person online, the less likely that is to be a really profitable engagement. Have 2 to 4 people. I don't know, those numbers are a little bit arbitrary, but it's more than one, but also doesn't need to be more than a few who know you intimately, meaning that you could call them at any point and or shoot them a text and say, hey, I really need to talk, it's serious or it's an emergency, and they'd say, yeah, and they would be there. And 2 to 4 people that will do that are worth more than 1,000 people that will follow you on Instagram. Be invested in a church or Christian community. A lot of you are heading off to college, if not this year, then in coming years, and very few things will be more important. I always tell my students that are graduating seniors, that I say, what's the question comes up like, what determines whether or not students after they graduate from my school, Providence, whether they'll remain Christians after they leave, the sort of Christian school bubble with all its attendant challenges. And I always say that the most telling variable is whether or not someone gets involved in community, in a rich community. That is the single most significant variable in determining whether or not someone continues on in their faith when they go to college. Good arguments are great, having a strong knowledge of your faith, essential, but this is, based on my experience, it's anecdotal, but that seems to be the most important. Place limitations on your social media use. Be aware of how much you use social media. Have any of you ever used a tracking app to find out how many hours you spend on social media? They exist. They will make you feel bad about yourself. You should do it. If you've never done it, you should do it. Absolutely, yeah. That's right. You could do that now, right after we're done. You could just go see where have you spent your time, and just buckle up. But the point is, we almost always underestimate how much we use our phones. We almost always underestimate how much time we spend on social media compared to what we actually do. Yeah. Yeah, that's something I do. So when I'm at school and teaching, I create timers on my browser that say I can only be on Facebook for 15 minutes cumulatively over the course of the day, because that's what I've determined is the amount of time I would need to do work-related things on our school's Facebook page, because I know that the second I open Facebook to do work-related things for my school, that I'll go, surf my timeline really fast. So, I forget, I'm blanking on what the name of the app is that I use as a Chrome extension for any of you who use Chrome as your browser. But you can do that. And that's a fun one, because if you want to change the settings, they make you do a big puzzle that takes 30 minutes if you want to change your settings. So you have to agree to it beforehand. But the point is, there's no easy out once you restrict yourself. Because if all you have to do is change the settings, then what's the point? Then it's not really a restriction at all. So here's just some suggestions on ways that you could restrict when, where, and how much you use social media. I can't emphasize, this is the single most helpful piece of advice that I've ever taken and actually applied in my life. Christy and I read a book called The Tech-Wise Family by a guy named Andy Crouch last year. And Crouch said one of his family principles is that there are no phones in the bedroom, that phones are charged out in a common space at night. And there are lots of good reasons for that. But the single biggest is that you will get more sleep. You won't wake up in the morning to say what are my notifications, those kind of things. We have this almost liturgical practice that when we wake up in the morning, we check our phones, right? What if instead of that, you started your morning by waking up and praying, by waking up and reading your Bible, by waking up and just having a cup of coffee. Any of those things would actually be better things to do with the first 5 minutes. Then after that, those notifications will be there. They're not going anywhere. So that's a piece of advice that I can't recommend highly enough. Christy and I implemented it when we finished reading the book, which would have been in the fall. And we just got a charging station. It sits out in our living room, and that's where our phones live. And it's been wonderful. Not always easy, but definitely a good thing. So you can limit your time per day. Moment is a good app that can do that. And then another principle from Andy Crouch's book, and this is with respect to tech altogether, but works really well for social media or just phones, is that you spend 1 hour a day, 1 day a week, and 1 week a year tech-free. Some of those things will feel like ideal. Some of those things might feel impossible to you. But I think that makes a lot of sense as a sort of Sabbath rest from technology, from social media. Can I do that? Can I spend an hour a day? Can I spend a day a week a year tech-free? It's possible. It can be done. So Christy and I have tried to implement that one too. We've been much less successful at actually doing that. I still believe it's a great idea. So we try to do Sunday mornings as our 1 day a week, so it's a half day. It's as close as we've gotten. And then Christy found out my soccer team plays a lot of times early on Sunday mornings, so that doesn't quite work. So we've got to come up with a better application. But again, thinking about, are there ways that I can create that kind of space? And then lastly, just interrogate your social media use. Why am I posting? Is it necessary? Do I actually have sufficient knowledge to comment on the thing? I know that Facebook says, "What do you think about this?" But you don't have to tell us. Will it edify, build up others? That's that others focusedness that someone pointed out. That sense of, is this just for me, or could it actually serve other people? Will it reach my intended audience? That's a good question. Could it be easily misunderstood? There are more questions that you could ask. But we're out of time. So just so you know, you can still follow me. I'm always looking for more followers. Twitter, Insta, cute babies help you gain followers. No, I'm kidding. But thank you so much. I know that we're out of time and I'll let you go. But if you have more questions, want to talk about any of this stuff, I'll hang around up here for a little bit. So thank you all.